Thank you, and I want to thank Sharak and Nancy for putting this together and for Kambi's Ganabasiri for including me in today's program. I'm very happy to be following on the papers that we've just heard. I feel that there's a lot of overlap and also some important differences that I think that will be fruitful for us in terms of thinking about Muslim philanthropy. I'm going to pull us down into a very local case study of a Zakat trust. And I'm an anthropologist of contemporary Islam, a trained Islamicist who focuses on ethnography. So in some ways, I'm shifting away from the bigger macro level questions of theology and also of humanitarianism that were raised in the previous presentations, though I think it's complementary. As we know, Zakat is a prescribed action that's meritorious, and it stands as a primary religious obligation for all Muslims to fulfill. Annually, giving a portion of one's wealth as zakat constitutes a significant moral action that brings about religious, material, and social effects. In theological terms, giving zakat is pious. It's an unambiguous gesture of doing what is right and has been commanded by God. As an obligatory practice, it affirms the piety of the giver and marks him or her as a righteous person. Yet zakat affects not just the giver, but also her or his wealth. According to tradition, zakat functions to purify the donor's remaining wealth and property. And thus, giving zakat sanctions material prosperity, in a sense. In the social realm, however, giving and receiving zakat binds people to each other. It reminds them that human well-being is ultimately linked, collective, and sustained through mutual support and recognition. So these multiple effects of zakat work together simultaneously and make it a very rich nexus between piety and sociality, or religion and society. And that's what I'm interested in. So I'm going to look closely at one particular zakat practice, the zakat trust in Hyderabad, Andhra Pradesh, and also now part of Telangana, in South India. And this case study traces how zakat is used by people as a way of engaging the very structures of poverty, meaning it shifts from giving to the poor, that simple distribution that we see during Ramadan and other times, as people try to attempt to redress poverty itself. And this shift instigated an experimental gender reform through zakat, focused on a countercultural resistance to dowry. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. Through the efforts of the Hyderabad Zakat and Charitable Trust, zakat emerges as a critical site for the reformation of Islamic gender ethics. The description of this trust's distinctive practice, which I'll give you, is followed by an analysis that argues that we need to consider zakat as a practical theodicy. It's a way that people counter what we could call the continuity of humanity's being and evil. It's a way for people to disrupt that. That's how people conceive of it. So it becomes a vehicle for shaping the practical efforts to limit precarity and to reject human disposability. So I'd encourage us to think about zakat in a couple different ways. First, that it's a practice. Second, that it's a site of experimental social reform. And third, as an existential dimension, that it has the weight of a practical theodicy for people, that it can take that on, certain practices of zakat. In the distribution of zakat, people make highly contextual decisions that enable them to fulfill the Quranic mandate to care for those who are vulnerable and suffering. The Quranic categories of zakat recipients include people who experience contingent hardship and distinct forms of suffering. Widows, women who must navigate life without a husband, orphans, vulnerable children who lack the security of protection and guardianship, and those who are indigent, whose lack of food and necessities put their very survival in question. Context-bound choices made in identifying recipients, the methods of transfer, and the interactions, or lack thereof, between zakat donors and recipients can reveal much about how suffering, mutuality, and well-being is understood in lived Islam. The Hyderabad Zakat and Charitable Trust, based in the South Indian city of Hyderabad, is a Sunni religious charity that collects annual zakat from its donors, who also volunteer for the trust. So they implement the distribution of zakat. The trust was formed in the aftermath of severe communal riots between Muslims and Hindus following the 1992 destruction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh in North India. Across India at this time, communal riots flared in many cities, including in the historic old city, the Purani Haveli of Hyderabad. Formed by several families that describe themselves as like-minded, the trust occupies a unique space for pious action outside of the parameters of reform movements or Islamist organizations and educational institutions. Most of the donors are wealthy elites. They're entrepreneurs and building contractors who have known each other for generations and whose extended families are intermarried. They have deep social network ties. They formalized their charity so that they could collaborate in their effort to help the poor, or as one donor clarified it, they try to help, quote, good poor people, you know, the ones who really need it, unquote. In the initial years after the Babri Masjid riots, the Zakat Trust focused on Muslim slum areas of the old city. And that slum that's a legal category in India. It refers to population density and access to water and sanitation. They opened healthcare clinics. They started income-generating projects. They founded schools. And these are the standard social service provisions of a lot of religious organizations across the world. But after more than a decade of running such projects, the donors of the trust decided to shift the majority of their work into the field of higher education by offering scholarships to college and university students. One donor volunteer described this shift in terms of divine guidance, saying, quote, God is pushing us in this direction, pulling us, end quote. By distributing their zakat as scholarships, the donors of the trust wanted to reform the practice of charity and make it into an opportunity to transform the circumstances of poverty itself. And we see this time and time again in zakat, that people want to push right to that edge where they're able to make some enduring and effective change. One volunteer donor clarified to me, quote, everything we were doing, it was just first aid, just stopgap measures. We gave zakat and still poor people were poor. We had to think about the long term, and education is the key if we want to change that. Not only in India, but everywhere, all over the world, Muslims have been sleeping the past 800 years. Right now, we're just a liability on the nation. We've been in a shell. We've got to change that. We've got to bring the Muslims up, bring them out of the shell. In the longer paper, I unpack a little bit of that discourse, but helping students move into higher education would change them from being asleep, being a liability, to being part of the nation, to being integrated and composite, awake, or as we say now in America, awoke. Importantly, this would not just change the circumstances of poverty, but it would also preserve a kind of religious normativity in Hyderabad. As one donor put it, we don't want to have a total madrasification of Islam here. I mean, this is our city. As part of the distribution of zakat, the trust makes an unusual claim on its students. It requires them to take an oath that they will not give or receive dowry. Dowry in South Asia, the practice of it is different than what is prescribed according to marriage practices in Islamic law, the fiqh of marriage. In South Asia, dowry is given by a bride's family to a groom's family, and that becomes part of the groom's family's wealth or property. So it puts a very large burden on the family of young girls to amass a significant amount of money in order for her to be married. So this has become, it has inhibited a lot of people from marrying as freely and as easily as they might like. Dowry's also been, of course, a site of, we could say, countercultural reform across many different religious groups in India. Hindus have also tried to push back against dowry as part of what is entrenched caste. So the trust is part of that Indian conversation about dowry, but they reframe it in a very uniquely Islamic way. They want to make a claim about it as an unethical practice for Muslims, right? So they make people take an oath saying that they will not give or receive dowry if they're a scholarship recipient. Linking zakat to the refusal of dowry explicitly introduces a critique of gender into zakat. According to tradition, zakat is to be given unconditionally. But the donors to the trust, they're aware of this. They're aware of those normative parameters that they themselves consciously transgress. One donor said, quote, "I know this could make our zakat impure. I know that. But we have to do it. We have them there. We have this opportunity. The stakes are too high. We have to say something," unquote. In the donor's view, dowry reinforces gender discrimination, which in turn reinforces low educational attainment in the Muslim community, and that further entrenches poverty. As the trust sees it, the ethical rejection of dowry reverses this cycle. It affirms gender equality and economic success, and importantly, it links the two. The trust makes the practice of zakat instrumental to the negotiation of gender relations, both in the family and in the public sphere. So it pushes charity to become a response to structural deprivation. And it also marks poverty as a gendered phenomena, right? The very categories that we see in the Quran are gendered. To be a widow, that's to be a recipient of zakat. But the trust recognizes that both men and women play gendered roles in the cycles of poverty, and it makes it incumbent upon both young men and women to resist the cultural pressures of dowry. So in supporting countercultural resistance to dowry, the trust is making space for an ethical Muslim subjectivity that affirms gender reform. When students take an oath to refuse dowry, they're compelled to make a moral commitment that connects the family and the public sphere. And this makes zakat into an occasion of ethical formation. Through the countercultural effort to end dowry, zakat inscribes both the donor and the recipient into a new moral field, the same ethical field, one that refuses practices of gender discrimination that entrench girls and families in cycles of debt. And those cycles of debt prohibit them from acquiring an education and fulfilling their economic potential. So through the oath for scholarship recipients, zakat becomes a mode of creating a new moral community in Hyderabad for Muslims. In making this shift from social service to higher education, the Zakat Trust is responding to a context of increasing poverty, educational deprivation, and inequality for Muslims in India. Recent studies have noted that the disparities between Muslims and all other demographic groups in India have widened. This is important because in about another 20 or 30 years, Indian Muslims will be the single largest global demographic group of Muslims, right? There'll be a larger population than Indonesia or Pakistan. Across India, all Muslim students have lower levels of educational attainment. Muslims are India's new untouchables on every single social science indicator. But in Muslim girls, this is especially the case. In the state of Andhra Pradesh, most Muslim girls are first-generation learners. Only 34% finish primary school, and less than 15% complete high school through grade 10. And those statistics are now about 10 years old, but it's probably not changed much. While all poor students in India suffer from the limitations of the nation and state governments to guarantee universal primary education, girls can also face additional sociocultural barriers to education, including the practice of restricting girls past puberty from attending school by justifying it through the practice of an Islamic gender segregation, or purda. By putting forth a critique of gender through the pledge to reform dowry and by giving scholarships, the Zakat Trust wants to eliminate any justification for the exclusion or repression of girls from education in the name of Islam. Thinking about zakat as practical theodicy, the philosopher Kenneth Surin puts forth a definition of practical theodicy that's helpful for us to understand what this particular instance of zakat is about, and it allows us to see its existential dimension. Surin states that if we, quote, evacuate theodicy from the realm of theory in order to relocate it in the realm of practice, we can abandon a purely theoretical or aesthetic approach to the problem of evil. And instead, we can view it as an essentially practical problem, unquote. This approach shifts the focus away from theological explanations of the question of evil and suffering, in order to explore how people answer the practical questions. What does God do to overcome the evil and suffering that exist in his creation? What do we, as creatures of God, do to overcome evil and suffering? These answers are everyday attempts to interrupt what Søren calls humankind's continuity in evil. And thus they constitute a practical theodicy, an attempt to interrupt the continuity of evil. The Trust's practice is an experimental one. They're shaping new moral communities and ethical subjectivities through the distribution of zakat. They endure rather than resolve the moral complications of their zakat practice, such as asking students to take an oath in order to respond to poverty and gender discrimination. They are, in the words of ethicist Willis Jenkins, quote, inventing new possibilities of cultural action from their cultural inheritances, unquote, in the hopes of making themselves and the recipients of zakat competent to the problems they face. The challenges, both theological and practical, of their experimental project are absorbed by a deeper moral rejection of precarity. I'm almost out of time, I know. For donors of the Trust, their actions to instigate Islamic gender ethics are a way of confronting poverty. And it's not just their own action. Søren's questions about practical theodicy, what does God do to overcome evil, and what do we do to overcome evil and suffering, imply that there are two separate modes of action, divine and human. Zakat donors, however, who form the Trust, they understand that they are actors in a shared human world, but they also understand their actions to be connected to a divine, transcendent reality. Human action and divine action remained identifiably distinct in nature, but in practice, donors sense that they're connected. Zakat is both obligatory and open, meaning it's not a given how you give it, even though the categories are identified. And that allows it to reflect distinct contextual realities and to bear a particular ethos in different places and different projects. In many parts of the globe, people connect zakat to the potential of education to ameliorate poverty, like the Trust does, and they use it for building schools. In some contexts, the theological significance of zakat takes priority. In other contexts, it might be the ethos of sacrifice in giving it. In contemporary Malaysia, James C. Scott chronicles how villagers distinguish between two practices of zakat. There's zakat that is paid to government religious officials who are institutionally required to collect it. That's called zakat raja. That's zakat of the king, which many villagers seek to evade. They try not to pay that zakat. And there's also that zakat which is given personally in order to ensure their fulfillment of Quranic obligations. Scott relates that villagers who evaded paying the official zakat did so without voicing a critique of governmentality. Thus, their resistance remained offstage. For the Zakat Trust, in contrast, the occasion to centralize critique is part of what makes zakat moral. Yet there is one important similarity between the village Scott studied and the Hyderabad Zakat and Charitable Trust case considered here. In both cases, people formed a uniquely local practice of zakat that is seen as a moral and authentic way of fulfilling the Quranic mandate to care for the poor and vulnerable, but also addresses the contingent forms of vulnerability in their own community. In the case of the Hyderabad Zakat and Charitable Trust, donors extend this response in an attempt to refuse precarity and change those social practices that make some lives more vulnerable than others. While a traditional sense of purification of wealth still characterizes zakat practices in some places and in some times, that complete and confident knowledge implied in the process of purification evades the donors of the trust. For them, zakat is an opportunity to experiment with countering vulnerability, disposability, and precarity, realities that have no place in their imagination of an Islamic social order. If any nuance of purification remains in their practice of zakat, it can be seen in removing or rupturing behavioral despair. Thank you.